The day I realized that needles could stitch not only fabric, but also invisible wounds, I knew my life would never be the same. Some memories weigh like stones hidden deep inside the soul, and the one I am about to share is one of them. I carried it in silence for many years, as if folding a torn dress and hiding it in the back of a closet, hoping time would erase it. But time doesn't erase. Time sews with fragile threads, and sometimes those threads snap suddenly. My name is Helen Marie Thompson. I'm 71 years old, and in my neighborhood people know me as the seamstress of forgotten brides. That's what they call me because I dedicate my hands to those young women who no longer have a mother to help them prepare for their wedding day. They find in me both an embrace and a pin placed at just the right spot. Today, I live from my craft in a small corner of my living room turned into a workshop, between fabrics hanging on the walls and an old, crooked mannequin. I spend my days sewing stories that don't belong to me, yet somehow save me from what I once was. It's not easy for me to open this wound, but I decided to do so when I saw my granddaughter scattering scraps of fabric across the floor as she played. She picked them up, cut them, mixed them as if they were treasures. Watching her, I felt that perhaps the moment had come to share my truth, not for myself, but because I want her to understand that even the most painful scars can be transformed into embroidery that brightens life. I know what I am going to tell you may hurt. Perhaps you, listening now, will feel a knot in your throat too, but I need you to come with me. I'll tell it as if it were a confession over coffee with a close friend, the kind who notices when you're holding back tears. Because this is not just any story. It is the story of my daughter, and also mine. When I think about what happened, I still feel the air turn thick, and my chest burns as if I can't breathe. I never imagined that love itself could hurt so deeply. I always believed that a mother and daughter were bound by a thread impossible to break, like the strongest seam in a wedding dress. But I learned that even the firmest threads can tear when one pulls too hard in the opposite direction. Maybe you wonder why I'm speaking now, after so many years of silence. The truth is, silence became unbearable. For a long time I told myself that keeping quiet was a way of protecting her, and myself. But silence is also a prison, and invisible bars weigh the heaviest. I have decided to unlock this cell today, even if my hands tremble and my voice breaks. Before I continue, I want to ask you for something simple. If my words touch you, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep sharing stories like this, stories that so often remain hidden in quiet homes. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It would mean so much to know I'm not alone in untying this knot. Taking a deep breath, I returned to the little girl I once was, in a small town in the American South, where life was measured by the smell of fresh cornbread and the church bells that marked the hours. That's where it all began, in a town where I first held a needle in my clumsy fingers, never imagining that one day that same needle would be the tool with which I would mend not only torn fabric, but also my own dignity. I grew up in a small town in the American South where days seemed to repeat themselves with a calmness I miss deeply now. The streets were dusty and unpaved. The houses were low and painted white, each porch decorated with pots of geraniums or rocking chairs that creaked in the summer evenings. The smell of fresh cornbread often mixed with the scent of soil after the rain, creating an atmosphere that belonged only to those slow-moving towns. Time didn't rush there. It slid gently, like an endless spool of thread. My mother worked as a laundress by the river. I remember her hands cracked from the cold water, scrubbing clothes against smooth stones while she hummed hymns that lightened the burden of her work. I often went with her, helping to spread the sheets over the bushes so the sun could dry them. Despite the hardship, she always found a way to smile, as if she carried a secret source of strength within her. Of my father, I have only a few blurry images: a hearty laugh, a wide-brimmed hat, and the sound of his boots walking away one, mourning never to return. He never came back, and though his absence hurt, my mother filled every corner of our lives with so much love that for a while the emptiness didn't swallow me whole. I grew up believing that sometimes family is built from what remains, not from what is missing. I was the oldest of three. My younger brother Samuel and my sister Grace were my inseparable companions. Together we invented entire worlds in the backyard, pirate ships made from old crates, castles of mud that collapsed in the rain, and crowns of wildflowers that lasted only as long as the afternoon sun. We didn't have money, but imagination made us rich, and every day was a new adventure. Church Sundays were the most anticipated. I can still see the women in their carefully pressed dresses and the men gathered outside discussing crops and politics. I would watch the lace on the ladies' hats and the wide skirts swaying as they walked, dreaming of one day making something similar with my own hands. Even then, I knew my destiny was somehow tied to sewing. The smells of my mother's cooking still linger in my memory. Chicken stew simmering slowly on the stove, biscuits she baked on cold mornings to keep us warm, and sweet fried dough sprinkled with sugar that she gave us on rainy afternoons. Sitting around that small kitchen table was a ritual of love, where scarcity disappeared between laughter and shared stories. My childhood was full of sounds that defined life in the South. The crowing of roosters at dawn, the barking of dogs chasing strangers down the road, and the bells of the little Baptist church calling us to gather. Each season brought a new landscape, blistering summers that left our skin sunburned, winters that chilled us to the bone, and springs bursting with colors and scents. School days were simple but precious. We often walked barefoot, carrying small slates and bits of chalk wrapped in cloth. Learning to read felt like discovering treasures, each word like a stitch, tying me closer to the world. My teacher, Mrs. Carter, encouraged me to write little stories, and I felt as if I were creating something magical every time I finished a sentence. In the afternoons, I loved sitting beside my mother as she sewed. It was her way of adding a bit of income to the house. She patched pants, mended shirts, and sometimes even made simple dresses for neighbors. I watched her hands, fascinated by the needle moving up and down as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Those moments were the beginning of my lifelong love for fabric and thread. One afternoon, she handed me a scrap of blue cloth and taught me how to thread a needle. I can still recall the thrill of holding that fragile thread, so delicate yet strong enough to unite what was broken. My stitches were uneven, clumsy, but she clapped her hands as if I had sewn a queen's gown. That day, I understood that my place in the world was between fabrics, needles, and patience. Summer nights held their own kind of magic. We would sit on the porch, under a sky crowded with stars, listening to the grown-ups tell ghost stories and old legends. I nestled close to my mother, feeling the safety of her embrace and the warmth of her voice. I don't think I've ever felt as protected as I did in those long, endless nights. Samuel was always the mischievous one, climbing trees to steal apples or running barefoot through fields, returning home with scraped knees and wild laughter. Grace was softer, tender, with a sensitivity that often amazed me. She loved brushing the hair of her rag dolls and dreamed of becoming a teacher like Mrs. Carter. The three of us formed a little army of dreams, held together by the strength of our mother. We didn't have store-bought toys, but we created them ourselves. We made cars from boxes, board games with buttons, and dresses for dolls from scraps of fabric. I was in charge of sewing them, and my siblings would wait eagerly for me to finish, ready to play with something made from our imagination. The church itself was another refuge for me, not so much for the sermons, but for the silence and coolness inside on hot days. I loved watching the stained glass windows lit by the sun, imagining they were giant embroideries of light. I often dreamed of one day creating dresses that would shine in the same way, as if they captured a piece of heaven. Even though life was tough, I don't remember those years as miserable. To me, they were full of abundance in what mattered most: love, unity, laughter, and the certainty that everything shared had more value than anything kept to oneself. Bare feet, hand-me-down clothes, and improvised games were part of a genuine, innocent happiness. The neighbors also shaped our childhood. Women shared food when someone lacked, and everyone watched over each other's children as if they were their own. That invisible net of solidarity held our community together. I grew up understanding that life was gentler when lived, alongside others, even when poverty tried to break us. As time passed, people began noticing my skill with a needle. Older women brought me aprons to mend, and I fixed them with a mixture of pride and shyness. My mother would watch me, her eyes full of tenderness, as if she could already see a different future stitched into my hands. She dreamed of me escaping the same harshness she had endured. I dreamed too, but my dreams were simple: to sew beautiful dresses to bring joy to others through them, and above all, to keep my family united. In that little corner of the world, I truly believed nothing could tear us apart, that the threads holding us together were eternal, and perhaps that's why the blow that came later shattered me so completely, ripping away my belief that simple happiness could last forever. The year I turned 13, life struck us with a heavy hand, sharp and merciless. My mother, the woman who seemed to carry endless strength, suddenly fell ill. At first, it was just fatigue she blamed on her work by the river. Then came dizzy spells, and finally fevers that no tea or prayer could cure. Seeing her in bed, still and weak, was like watching a church crumble stone by stone, something you thought eternal collapsing right before your eyes. I tried to take her place at home. I rose before dawn to prepare whatever food I could, dressed my siblings, and walked them to school. But the absence of her laughter, of her steady voice, turned every task into a burden, almost too heavy to bear. Our home, once a refuge, now felt like a ship drifting without a captain. Neighbors did what they could. They brought cornbread, jars of soup, or kept an eye on Samuel and Grace when I had to run errands. But no kindness could replace the presence of a mother. Each day, the illness stole a little more of her, and at night I sat by her bed, with a candle flickering, whispering prayers to a God who seemed deaf. One evening, she held my hand tighter than I expected. Her eyes locked onto mine, and in a trembling voice she said, "Take care of your brother and sister, Helen. Be strong, stronger than I was." Those words seared into me like a stitch pulled too tight. At that moment I knew my childhood had ended. A few days later, the town gathered quietly outside our house. My mother was gone. The church bells tolled a mournful song, the cruelest sound I had ever heard. Dressed in black, with Samuel clutching one hand and Grace the other, I walked behind her, coughing, each step tearing a piece of me apart. The house felt hollow without her. The scent of her cooking vanished, the hymns she hummed by the river silenced, and nights became unbearably still. My siblings cried themselves to sleep, and I tried to console them, though I was drowning in the same emptiness. I wanted to scream, to break apart, but her last words held me together. I had promised to be strong. That's when whispers started among the neighbors. "She's too young to carry so much. Who will take care of them now?" Each phrase cut like a knife wrapped in sympathy. Fear grew inside me. Fear that someone would separate us, send Samuel and Grace away. That fear forced me to grow faster than I should have. Not long after, an aunt we barely knew came to visit. She brought promises of help, spoke softly, offered words dressed in sweetness. But her eyes gave her away. Behind them was more interest than affection. She insisted family had to step in, that children needed an adult to lead them. Something about her tone unsettled me, like a seam poorly stitched, ready to rip at the slightest pull. The first time I saw her moving our things as if they already belonged to her, I realized life would never be the same. The spaces that had been my mother's began to fill with another presence, a new order creeping in without permission. Between the loss of my mother and the arrival of those shadows, my childhood shattered completely. Home was no longer a refuge, but a foreign land, and without knowing it yet, I was about to face a darker pain, one that would mark me forever. Not long after my mother's death, it was my Uncle Robert who moved into our home. He arrived under the pretense of helping, of taking responsibility for the orphans, like a dutiful brother of the deceased. At first, neighbors praised him, calling him generous, a man who had sacrificed his own life to protect us. But I, even then, watched him with unease. There was a glint in his eyes that made my stomach twist. He quickly claimed authority over everything. He rearranged the furniture, dictated what meals we'd have and when, even controlled the hours we could step outside. To Samuel and Grace, still so young, he was simply another adult with rules. But I, already alert to small signs, sensed something darker beneath his strictness. The first warning came in the form of silence. "We don't talk about your mother anymore. The past is gone," he said one evening at dinner. His words were a slap to my soul. It was as if he wanted to erase her completely, to rip out the very memory of the woman who had held us together. That night I learned to swallow tears quietly in the dark. Soon punishments became part of life. If Grace cried too much, she went to bed without supper. If Samuel played outside longer than Robert allowed, he was met with a belt. I tried to shield them, invent excuses, draw attention away, and often that meant the punishment fell on me instead. I will never forget the first slap across my face. It came because I refused to throw away one of Mama's old dresses. My cheek burned, but worse than the pain was Samuel and Grace's frightened eyes realizing life had shifted forever. That day, my body became a ledger of invisible stitches, each blow a mark etched deep within. The worst part wasn't the blows, but the constant manipulation. He reminded me endlessly that without him we'd be homeless, that nobody else would care for us, that I should be grateful for his protection. That word, protection, dripped into me like poison until I began doubting my own sense of right and wrong. With time, he tightened control over even the smallest details. He forbade me to sit by the window with my sewing, claiming, "Decent girls don't put themselves on display." He insisted I wear long dresses even in the sweltering summer. Every movement felt judged, and soon I found myself shrinking, trying to disappear into my own shadow. The nights became unbearable. I lay awake, listening to his footsteps pacing the house, the creak of floorboards under his weight. My heart raced whenever those steps paused near my door. He never came inside, but his presence there, lingering, froze me in terror. I slept fully dressed, prepared to flee at any moment. Sometimes he stood too close when speaking, brushing my shoulder or touching my hair in ways that felt anything but innocent. I'd flinch, step away, but his smirk told me he knew exactly what he was doing. I lived in constant dread, trapped in a fog of threats that never fully revealed themselves but always hovered near. My siblings couldn't understand my fear. To them, Uncle Robert was harsh but dependable, the man who kept food on the table. They whispered to me to stop making him angry, to just obey, and so I kept quiet, convinced my silence was the only shield that might keep them safe. Once, he forced me to accompany him to the market. He walked too close behind me, murmuring that I should learn to act like a proper woman. Each word felt heavy, dangerous. To anyone else, we were just an uncle and niece shopping. That disguise of normalcy was my prison. Gradually, his control became more psychological. He told me Samuel and Grace's happiness rested entirely on my shoulders, that if anything went wrong, it would be my fault. The weight crushed me because, in part, it was true. They looked to me as a second mother. He had me cornered between fear and responsibility. At times he feigned kindness, handing me an old scarf, telling me I was the smartest of the bunch. But those crumbs of affection were chains in disguise. They tangled me in confusion, making me doubt myself, wonder if the cruelty was somehow my imagination. The day he forbade me from attending school was when I felt the ground pulled from beneath me. "Books won't keep you fed. What you need to learn is right here," he said coldly. My tears fell silently, knowing he had stolen not just my present, but any chance at a different future. Still, I clung to small refuges. I smuggled scraps of cloth into the attic, hiding needles and thread in secret places. Each hidden stitch was my rebellion, my proof that he couldn't strip everything from me. In that attic sanctuary, I whispered hope into every seam, but even that refuge was threatened. One day he discovered my secret sewing and tore the fabric from my hands. Yelling that I was wasting time, I picked up the pieces quietly, but inside, I swore he would never erase the part of me that needed to create, even if only in my mind. Fear soon became my second skin. I measured each step, spoke in whispers, kept my eyes low. The house was a minefield, every gesture a possible mistake. I lived in constant anticipation, trying to predict the storms by the tilt of his hat or the way he shut a door. Sometimes I thought of running away, but where could I go? I had no money, no allies, nowhere to flee. Robert was respected in town, known as hard-working and devoted. I was only a girl, and my voice would vanish into disbelief. The terror eventually became routine. I learned to smile in public, to pretend everything was fine, while inside I was unraveling. That double life exhausted me, but it kept suspicion at bay. Survival required me to play the part he demanded, so my teenage years began under the shadow of a man who robbed me of freedom, silenced my voice, and fed on fear. I'll never forget what it felt like to be imprisoned. Inside my own home, unable to scream or escape. That was when I learned. Not all prisons have bars. Some are built from words, silences, and the eyes that watch you until you disappear. Life at home became a series of calculated steps. Every move had to be measured to avoid sparking Robert's anger. I woke earlier than my siblings, prepared breakfast from stale bread and watered-down milk, and served it quietly, knowing even a small clatter could lead to punishment. The house wasn't a home anymore. It was a chessboard, and every move carried risk. I learned to walk without creaking the floorboards, to breathe shallowly when he passed by, to vanish into corners when his voice sharpened. Samuel and Grace looked at me as though I carried some hidden map for survival. In a way, I did. My body became a compass, sensing storms before they arrived. Nights were the longest. I lay fully clothed, a candle hidden under the bed in case I had to run. Sometimes his footsteps stopped outside my door, and I froze, holding my breath. He never came in, but the weight of his presence was enough to turn my blood to ice. My body began to show the toll. Deep shadows grew under my eyes from sleeplessness. Bruises dotted my arms from his outbursts, which I covered with loose sleeves. I became skilled at offering excuses whenever someone noticed. Smiles became my mask, stretched thin but convincing enough to deflect questions. In town, people saw me as a quiet, dutiful girl. Some said I had inherited my mother's strength. Others that I was too serious for my age. Nobody imagined that behind the silence lived a child breaking piece by piece while struggling to hold two younger lives together. Grace, with her gentle nature, often crept into my bed at night, too afraid of the dark. I held her tightly, whispering promises I didn't know if I could keep, that I would never let anything harm her. That vow was my anchor, the reason I forced myself to endure. Samuel, restless and fiery, began testing Robert's rules. His defiance often ended under the sting of a belt. I threw myself between them whenever I could, taking the punishment instead. Pain on my body was easier to bear than the sight of my brother's spirit breaking. School became a memory. Without books or lessons, my world shrank to the walls of the house. Sometimes I heard children's laughter outside, their games drifting through the window like knives. I closed my eyes and stitched in my imagination, sewing dresses that could never exist. I found secret havens. The attic became my sanctuary, where I hid scraps of cloth, needles tucked inside old jars, buttons collected from the floor. There I sewed quietly in the dim light, each stitch a prayer, each finished piece a defiance against the silence. Silence itself became armor. The less I spoke, the safer we all were. I answered in short words, lowered my head, played the role of obedience. But that same silence was also a cage, locking away my voice, keeping me from calling for help. On market days, I watched other girls my age laugh freely, walk arm in arm, while I trailed behind Robert carrying bags. Every step was monitored, every glance corrected. I lived both invisible and under constant scrutiny, trapped in a paradox only I could feel. My body responded to fear with its own language. Chest pains, hands sweating, a constant knot in my throat. Anxiety lived inside me like a sickness I could never cure. Sometimes anger rose inside me, burning, hot. I clenched my fists until my palms bore red marks, bit my lip to keep from screaming. But I buried that anger, knowing unleashing it could bring danger to my siblings. Protecting them mattered more than my own release. Grace asked once why I always wore long sleeves in the summer heat. I lied, saying I preferred the fabric. She studied me with an intensity that told me she suspected the truth. Her silence in return was its own form of solidarity. Samuel grew impatient with my warnings to keep calm, but I told him often, the best fight is sometimes the one you don't pick. He didn't always understand, yet he listened, and that gave me hope I might keep him safe. In secret, I sewed again. I tucked thread into the hem of my dress, hid needles in old books. I made a bow for Grace, patched Samuel's pants. These little acts reminded me that I still had power over something, however small. Mrs. Carter, my old teacher, once stopped me in the street. She asked why I no longer came to school. I gave a rehearsed excuse, saying home needed me. She placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "You're too smart to stay silent." Her words lingered like a hidden flame in my chest. I turned my rage into fuel. Every blow I endured, I told myself I was gathering strength for a day yet to come. I didn't know when, but I dreamed of the moment when I would finally release it all. Some nights, instead of crying, I stood by the window, gazing at the far-off lights of other homes. I wondered if inside those walls there were stories like mine, silences like mine. Believing I wasn't the only one gave me strange comfort. Sewing became my secret language. In my stitches, I wrote messages no one could read. Hold on, resist, this will pass. It was like creating a gown for a future version of myself, one I wasn't yet ready to wear but kept hidden in hope. Resistance also lived in caring tenderly for Samuel and Grace. I told them bedtime stories, spun worlds without fear, held them close whenever possible. They were my purpose, the reason I couldn't collapse. Each smile I coaxed from them was a victory. It reminded me that even in a ruined life, joy could still exist. Fragile, but real. The neighbors noticed my thin frame and tired eyes. Some handed me bread or milk, their gestures kind but wordless. No one dared to ask questions. In that time and place, family matters stayed behind closed doors, and Robert's reputation kept suspicion quiet. Loneliness pressed on me like a heavy quilt. I feared that if I shouted, no one would hear, that my pain didn't exist beyond my skin. That thought haunted me, that my suffering might vanish without witness. To survive, I developed rituals, counting floorboards as I walked, whispering prayers under my breath, stroking the buttons I hid as if they were charms. These small actions grounded me, proof that I still existed. Robert, believing his control was absolute, grew careless. That gave me tiny spaces of freedom. When he was gone, I taught Samuel and Grace to read, told them stories, gave them slivers of a normal childhood. The seasons passed, marked by freezing winters and sweltering summers. Each year felt like proof that time moved forward, but my prison stayed the same. I wore a mask for the world, polite smiles, helpful hands, the perfect obedient girl. That mask was exhausting but necessary. Without it, suspicion might have cost us everything. Mama's voice lived on in my memory, sometimes in the dead of night. I heard her say, "Be strong, Helen." Those words stitched me together, keeping me from unraveling. I became skilled at predicting Robert's moods. The way he set his hat down, the rhythm of his footsteps, they all warned me of storms. That instinct was my shield, a survival tool sharper than any knife. Dreams of escape flickered but always ended in the same reality. No money, no allies, no place to go. All I could do was endure, day after day, clinging to the fragile hope that something would one day change. Adaptation became my survival. I turned into silence, into shadow, into feigned obedience. Yet deep inside, a small flame refused to die, and I knew someday that light would guide me out. Over time, I realized survival wasn't enough. I needed to resist. Even if my resistance was invisible to everyone but me, I couldn't fight openly. That would have put Samuel and Grace in danger. So I chose small rebellions, silent victories. Each hidden stitch, each secret act reminded me that Robert didn't own all of me. I began to study him carefully. I read his body the way I once read words in a book. The slam of his hand on the table meant punishment was coming. Long silences were more dangerous than yelling. The tight press of his lips meant I had to protect the children quickly. Learning his patterns became my weapon, my only form of control. When he dragged me to the market, I pretended to obey, but I listened closely to conversations around me. Women spoke of jobs in other towns, of girls who had run away to the city, of teachers who sometimes took in children. I stored every detail, piecing together a secret map for an escape I couldn't yet attempt. One afternoon in the town square, Mrs. Miller, a neighbor, caught my gaze. She said nothing, but her eyes held questions, suspicion. I dropped my eyes immediately, too afraid to confirm what she might have guessed. Still, that look cracked a wall inside me. Someone had noticed. At night I returned to the old notebooks I'd saved from school. By candlelight, I scribbled fragments of thoughts. I didn't dare write everything. The fear of him finding it was too great. But even short sentences gave me relief. It was proof I could still name my pain. Grace grew old enough to sense the truth. She asked once why I covered my arms in the summer heat. I told her I simply liked long sleeves. She stared back with an understanding far beyond her years. That quiet knowing between us was its own form of resistance. Solidarity without words. Samuel, though, became bolder with age. His defiance frightened me. I worried his anger would explode against Robert and that would destroy us. I began teaching him patience, whispering lessons about silence and waiting. Sometimes the strongest fight is the one you don't fight, I told him. He didn't always understand, but he listened. I secretly began sewing again. I hid thread in the hem of my skirt, tucked needles into the pages of an old Bible, a bow for Grace, a mended shirt for Samuel. Each small creation was a rebellion stitched in defiance. My siblings didn't see it that way, but I did. Those stitches were my freedom. Mrs. Carter, my old teacher, saw me once in town. She asked why I no longer came to school. I lied, telling her my family needed me at home. She squeezed my shoulder gently and said, "You're too smart to stay silent." Her words stayed with me, echoing in the darkest moments like a lantern in the distance. My anger stopped being just pain and began to feel like fuel. Each time I endured him without breaking, I told myself I was gathering strength for a day that would come. I didn't know when, but I pictured it as a breaking point where my voice would return full force. Some nights, instead of crying, I stared out the window. The lights from other homes flickered far away, and I imagined behind those walls were other girls like me, silent and afraid. That thought gave me strange comfort. Maybe I wasn't alone, even if the world stayed quiet. Sewing became my secret code. In my stitches, I whispered to myself, "Hold on, resist, this will end." It was like creating a gown for the woman I hoped to become, a woman who would one day wear freedom as her fabric. I resisted most of all by loving Samuel and Grace fiercely. I told them bedtime stories, created imaginary worlds where no one could hurt us, and held them until they felt safe. Protecting their innocence became my rebellion against Robert's cruelty. And so, between silence and hidden defiance, I began to weave the certainty that I still carried strength inside me. I didn't know when, but I knew a day would come when that small flame of resistance would burst into something stronger, something that could finally break our chains. The day everything shattered didn't look any different at first. Sunlight filtered through the cracks of the window. Samuel and Grace ate their quiet breakfast, and I, as always, tried to read Robert's mood. But the air was heavier that morning, thick with something I couldn't name. It was as if the house itself was bracing for what was coming. Robert had been drinking since early. His steps were unsteady, his voice harsher, every word landing like a threat. I tried to keep Samuel and Grace out of his way, sending them to the attic with old toys while I stayed downstairs. My chest thudded like a drum, my whole body whispering danger. At midday, he ordered the children to their rooms and told me to stay in the kitchen. His eyes carried a look that froze me, a mix of anger and something else I had long feared. I backed against the table, hands trembling, heart racing. This was the moment I had dreaded in countless sleepless nights. When he stepped closer, something inside me snapped. A strength I didn't know I had surged through me. I shoved him hard and bolted for the hallway, slamming myself into Samuel and Grace's room. I locked the rusty bolt just as he crashed against the door. His fists pounded the wood, each strike rattling the walls. He shouted words that burned in my ears, words I will never forget. I clutched my siblings close, whispering for them to stay quiet. Every thud felt like the house might splinter apart, but I refused to give in. In that moment, I knew silence was no longer an option. My voice might not stop him, but my actions could. Waiting had ended. The only path left was escape. When the pounding paused, I seized the moment. I pried open the window, low enough to risk a jump. My hands shook as I helped Samuel down first. Then Grace. Their wide eyes pleaded with me to hurry. I finally leapt myself, hitting the ground hard but steady. For the first time in years, I felt the earth beneath me as freedom instead of prison. We ran barefoot through the dusty streets, our breaths sharp, not daring to look back. We reached Mrs. Miller's house, the same neighbor who had once looked at me with suspicion. She opened the door and froze, taking in our ragged faces. She didn't ask questions. She simply pulled us inside, shutting the door with finality. She hid us in her kitchen, giving us water, her hands firm but kind. "You're safe now," she said softly, brushing my hair back. It was the first time in years that someone spoke to me with compassion instead of judgment. That evening, the sheriff came. I don't remember Mrs. Miller's words, only the fear in my chest as I tried to explain, my voice cracking but steady. For the first time, I named the silence, out loud. Each word was like ripping open a wound, but it was also a release. The town was divided. Some defended Robert, others believed me. But by then, it didn't matter. What mattered was that we were no longer alone, no longer bound by his shadow. If this part of my story touched your heart, please give this video a like so others can find strength through it. And don't forget to subscribe. That way, more hidden stories like mine can finally find light. That day didn't give me back my lost childhood, but it gave me something else. The certainty that my voice, once silenced, could still rise. And that certainty, born of pain, became the seed of a new beginning. After that day, nothing was ever the same. Samuel, Grace, and I were placed with a nearby family willing to take us in while the authorities decided our future. Adjusting wasn't easy, but for the first time in years, I could fall asleep without fearing footsteps outside my door. Freedom wasn't complete, but it was enough to let me breathe again. Slowly, my siblings began to recover pieces of their childhood. Samuel played outside again, though his laughter carried a new edge of seriousness. Grace brushed her doll's hair and hummed softly, as if she was sewing her own innocence back together. Watching them laugh felt like a gift, proof that the sacrifices had been worth it. As for me, I clung to sewing more than ever. With every thread, I repaired not just fabric but myself. Dresses, shirts, small handkerchiefs. Each piece became a symbol of resistance and survival. Sewing wasn't just a skill anymore. It was my way of turning brokenness into beauty. Years passed, and Robert became little more than a scar. The memory didn't vanish. Sometimes it haunted my dreams, sometimes it flickered in a stranger's stare. But I learned not to let his shadow steal my light. My strength wasn't in forgetting, but in refusing to be defined by him. I never saw him again. Part of me wanted justice, but another part knew that justice had already been served. He no longer held power over me. That was enough. My freedom was not in revenge, but in reclaiming my voice and my dignity. Now, when I look back, I see that the girl who once lived in silence grew into the woman I am today, resilient, tender, and capable of weaving pain into hope. Every wedding gown I sew carries a hidden thread of that story, stitched with the quiet vow that no bride should ever walk alone into her future. If this story spoke to you, please give it a like, subscribe, and share it. Your support gives me the strength to keep telling stories like this, stories that so often stay hidden in the shadows of ordinary homes. And I'd love to know, what did you feel listening to my story? Leave me a comment, because healing doesn't happen only when we speak. It also happens when someone listens with an open heart.